week 4 of Cultivate. Nearly a month on this journey together. So far in Cultivate, we've asked 3 questions. Why are we here? Why do we plant? How do we start? And this week, we're asking ourselves the 4th question. What do we plant? As usual, let's begin with a 1-minute recap to remind ourselves where we've got to so far in our first 3 weeks. So here we go. In week 1, we looked at the reason we're doing Cultivate, and we learned that we're due a revolution in the church. Alongside what's familiar to us, we'll be seeing new worship communities starting up. And we learned that God's not looking for strength and talent from us. He's looking for devotion and dependence. In week 2, we asked the question, why do we plant? And we suggested that we need to raise our sense of urgency by both looking at the brutal reality of where we are as a church and the hopeful prospect. We can do something about it. And that something we suggest is planting. Planting new worship communities helps us engage with people beyond our current communities of faith. Last week, we looked at how do we start, suggesting the course of missional discipleship is a journey, and it begins with a story of discernment. Call and vision. God normally calls us to the places we already inhabit, to those people we already encounter. Okay, that's our 1-minute recap. So let's get started on week 4 as we try and answer our next question. What do we plant?
There's a book that was released in the 1990s that ended up selling over 1 million copies, and it was called High Fidelity. It's about a guy called Rob Fleming who owns a record shop in London and whose lawyer girlfriend has just left him. And Rob Fleming likes to make lists. He makes top 5 lists of everything. He makes lists of books and films and even his top 5 breakups. Thankfully, I haven't got a lot in common with Rob Fleming. But I have one thing in common with him. I love to make my top 5 lists. I have lists of my top 5 films. I have a list of my top 5 millionaire shortbreads. Genuinely, the best sermon I've ever preached was the top 5 things that Jesus said. Anyway, so it's inevitable that we're going to bring you a list of the top 5 characteristics of a worship community. And that is because this week and next week, we'll be answering this question. What are we planting? At the end of week 3, we started to look at what worship communities are. And we said they are not something that replaces the old but sits alongside it, but they have some key differences and also some similarities to our traditional understanding of church. So over these 2 next weeks, we're going to offer you what we feel are the top 5 characteristics of a new worship community. And you know what? Every once in a while in Cultivate, I wish I had a big red button that we could push, or a siren or foghorn, that's something that goes off when something important is going to be said. Well, I've just pushed the big red button. The foghorn has just gone off. If you've fallen asleep already, wake up and hear this. Our top 5 principles are not in any particular order, but this one is definitely number 1. If your journey, your community, your plant hasn't got a specific, articulated, focused missional purpose, can I say, don't plant it. Planting doesn't make sense without it. You need to have missional vision, a specific missional purpose in this thing that you are doing. Missional vision answers this fundamental question. What's the purpose of what we're doing? And who are those people, that neighborhood or network that we are called to? And in our last session, we said a planter's journey begins with call and vision. And we said that if you read your Bibles, you'll find that virtually every person God calls begins their journey with these 2 things. God calls you, and he gives you some idea of where you are going. Well, it's true for individuals, and it's true for worship communities. Whatever this community is that you are planting or joining, God has set you apart for a particular journey. He has called you, and he will give you some kind of vision for your destination. So how do you work out what your missional vision is, and how do you articulate it? We do an exercise called the Pyramid Review with worship community leadership teams that helps them to do a number of things. And one of them is to identify their missional vision. And here's a simple exercise that we do with these teams. When we meet, we get each of them in pairs to write out what they think the missional vision is for their community. But this is how they must write it. Firstly, they must use 8 words or less, because we want them to be clear And concise, 8 words is actually long enough to be specific, short enough to be really concise. And secondly, they must write it in this format: verb, target group, outcome. Here are a couple of examples of this, completely unrelated to what you'll be doing. An animal welfare group might have a mission statement of save endangered species from extinction. The verb is, of course, save. Target group is endangered species. The outcome is from extinction. 5 words, and you know exactly what they're doing. A ministry based in Africa might have a mission statement of improve Zambian children's health. The verb is improve. Target group is Zambian children. The outcome is health. 4 words. And you know exactly what they're doing. The aim for this is ending up with a tight, specific, clear missional purpose for your worship community. It describes what you're doing, who's it for, and what you want to see happen. That's what purpose, that's what missional vision is all about. And in our experience of helping worship communities work through missional vision, let me just add a few final thoughts. Firstly, the more specific your missional vision, the more effective your mission. That is why some people have realized that parishes have struggled in working out missional vision, because even in small parishes, as we said before, there are hundreds of different demographics and ages and subcultures and neighborhoods and networks. It's like those divots in the waffle that we spoke about last week. Identifying missional vision from that can be really difficult. Oftentimes in this process, I poke and I prod, get more specific. It's too vague. I often tell people that if you can't hold a mental picture of the type of person you're trying to engage, then you have yet to land on missional vision. The more specific your missional vision, the more effective your mission. Secondly, form the community on the basis of your missional vision. Groups always gather on the basis of something, and Christian groups are no different. It could be friendship or proximity or shared interest, whatever. So let me just say this. If you don't gather on the basis of missional vision, you probably won't have that in common. And therefore, it's very difficult for mission to happen. That is why it's important to establish missional vision at the beginning of a journey. I have encountered groups who have gathered first on whatever basis and then tried to work out the missional vision later. And some of them realize that they're actually called to something else or different things. If you want to be missionally effective, gather on the basis of your missional vision. Have that in common. And then we could say more. I'll just say one more thing. Use your missional vision as a filter for all your decisions. Your missional vision should become your bedrock, your anchor, the magnetic north of your worship community. It's not an activity that you do once. It's a filter that you use always. As we'll see next week, your missional vision is the start of your plan to make and grow disciples. Your missional vision should be at the center of all your decision making about your community. You should be asking yourself, does this decision help our missional vision or hinder it? Use your missional vision as a filter for all your decisions. So identifying missional vision is vitally important for a community, but added to that, it's vital to establish missional culture. Missional vision is vital. It establishes the missional purpose and direction of your plan, your community, but missional culture is also vital. This means that it isn't just the community that is focused on mission, but each individual is focused on it as well. It's a collective and an individual responsibility. It's part of the culture. It's establishing that mission is what we do around here. It's believing that each one of us holds the dynamite of the gospel in our hands. It resides in us and multiplies through us. Here's an illustration of what I'm talking about. Let's say that the entire world's population of Christians were wiped out, totally gone, apart from one worship community in Liverpool Diocese somewhere that had 100 people in it. And imagine that amazingly, in one of their worship services, 1,000 new people showed up and all of them become Christians. And the leaders gathered after that to work out what they should do. And they decided that revival had broken out. Of course it had. And so they decided to hold a worship service every single day. And in each of those services held every day, 1,000 new people came and all of them became Christians. And people started coming from across the country and the world to this amazing thing happening in Liverpool, in the Diocese of Liverpool. If all that happened, do you know how long it would take for the whole world to become a Christian? Everybody a Christian. Get a number in your mind. Don't try and work it out. You haven't got time. Just guess instinctively. I'll give you the answer in 5 seconds. It would take 10,000 years. But say that worship community of 100 people in Liverpool Diocese, after sort of thinking and praying, they decided to do something differently. Each of those 100 people decided to bring one person to Jesus in the next year. And they did. And the next year, those 200 people decided, let's do it again. Each person bring one person to Jesus in that year. And they did. And they kept on doing it, each one bringing one to Jesus each year. Do you know how long it would take for our entire world to be evangelized, for the whole world to become a Christian? Again, think of a number. Don't work it out. You haven't got time. Just guess. I'll give you the answer in 5 seconds. It would take 32 years. How realistic is it to have a worship service so devastatingly good that it produces 1,000 new converts every time and every day? That hasn't happened since Pentecost. And that only happened once. And yet, how realistic is it to imagine each disciple bringing one person to Jesus every year? Of course, it's realistic. And this is what God always intended. But it's going to involve a change of mindset and priority and culture, a culture that someone once described as each one reach one. It means remembering that our gospel works, training each other how to share it more effectively. It means maintaining relationships with those beyond our worship communities. It means encouraging new converts to share the gospel immediately. It means holding each other accountable to it. And as we shall see in 2 weeks' time, it means praying like mad for it. The gospel is dynamite in the hands of a disciple who uses it. You hold dynamite in your hands. It's powerful. It's life-changing. It's called the gospel. If each of us took it and shared it, we could re-evangelize our world in one generation. That's how powerful it is. Missional vision and missional culture are both massively important principles for planting for a new worship community, the number one on our top 5. So for our current discussion, why don't we start to think through what the missional vision is or could be for your current church or worship community, or maybe a new worship community. If you could turn to page 20 in your workbook and go through the questions on that sheet. And if you have time, from those answers, maybe you could start to put together an 8-word missional vision using the verb, target group, outcome pattern that we mentioned before. We'll see you again in 15 minutes.
A guy called Dwight D. Eisenhower, who happened to be a 5-star general and then 34th President of the United States, had a mantra that he lived by and led by. He apparently had it written over his desk. It's known as the Eisenhower's decision principle. It goes something like this. What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. And if you've ever studied time management, you may have heard of a guy called Stephen Covey, who's used this to form a decision-making matrix, helping people work through how to make good decisions in their life and in their leadership. This matrix looks a bit like this. You may recognize it, but bear with me, because I just want to recap what these 4 quadrants are and what they mean. Quadrant 1 talks about things that are both important and urgent. They are things like tax deadlines, your pregnant wife's water breaking, job applications. They are tasks that require our immediate attention, and they also work towards fulfilling our long-term goals and mission in life. Quadrant 2 talks about tasks that are not urgent but are important. These don't have a pressing deadline, but nonetheless help you achieve your life goals or mission. These are typically centered around strengthening relationships, planning for your future, improving yourself. These gurus tell us we should spend most of our time on quadrant 2 activities. These are the big ones. But the problem with these is because there's no pressing deadline, most of us never get around to them. I'll fix a day out with the kids one day. I'll go to the gym tomorrow. I'll sort out my prayer life next week. When we make New Year's resolutions, we nearly always make them about this stuff. We never make New Year's resolutions about quadrant 3. Quadrant 3 are those things that demand our attention now, but don't have any real inherent value. They don't work towards achieving our goal or mission. These gurus would say many people spend a lot of their time in this quadrant thinking they're quadrant 1. These tasks are often done using other people's agendas. They're sometimes interruptions. Clergy and church leaders spend quite a bit of time in quadrant 3. Quadrant 4 are neither important or urgent. They're primarily distractions. After you've spent an hour reading other people's posts on Facebook or on YouTube, watching the top 10 fails on a treadmill, you've been in quadrant 4. Again, we spend too much time in this quadrant. It's actually useful to have some time of this, but experts tell us less than 5% of our time should be spent here. And I would say if you have time later, it'd be really useful to go through your life and work out how much time you're spending in each quadrant and what activities you are doing in each. But right now, I want to use it to analyse what it is we're planting. But we've changed the term. Urgency, as we have heard, is a very important idea. Without urgency, change doesn't occur. So we don't want urgency to have any sort of negative connotation. It's too vital for that. So we've used the term insistent rather than urgent. In Cultivate, it's the insistent/important matrix. One of the main reasons that worship communities, new and established ones, don't make and grow disciples is that we focus on the insistent and not the important. The assistant things are things that are patterns in our communities that normally have some kind of deadline or priority, and there's often a huge drive to perform them or to ensure they happen. Here are some examples of what's found in box 1. As a massive one, something that always happens, whether you're a fresh expression or a church plant or a traditional church, whether you meet in a warehouse or a retail unit or a Norman church. And what is that? Happens every week. It's the worship service. But here are some other examples I've had direct experience of. For instance, I know those who are called to the homeless or marginalised, and their box 1 stuff is caring for practical needs of the target group, drop-ins, food and drink, night shelter, for other injustice initiatives which are vital and brilliant ways to bring the gospel to our wider culture. It might be other things. I've known planters who were chaplains in schools and college, and for them it was the issues of pastoral support. Sometimes for our worship communities, the box 1 activity is actually community, establishing relationships, building social interaction. It might even, unbelievably, be Bible study. For other groups, it will mean something specific for you. These things are all important. But if I was to ask you what lives in quadrant 2, for all of us, then what would it be? Those things which are important may be the most important, but there is no pressing deadline. And so sometimes we rarely get round to it. One day, someday, tomorrow, next week. There might be other things that are in box 2, but one big one is the making and growing of disciples. And let me say some strong things about this. Box 1 stuff is sometimes in opposition to box 2 stuff. It can suck the oxygen out of box 2. Even though this stuff is good, sometimes they overwhelm and they overcome box 2. One of the reasons worship communities aren't missional is because of what happens in box 1. Good things, but good things that overwhelm essential things. So how do we reverse that? How do we ensure that our worship communities are actually making and growing disciples? What do the gurus who talk about the urgent important matrix say about making quadrant 2 stuff happen? It's a simple yet vital principle, and that is you are going to need to be intentional about it. You will need, and this might horrify some people, to plan for it. One of the lessons for planters is that we needed to invest in and plan for the whole discipleship journey, the whole journey. One of the reasons that worship communities aren't missional is that we don't plan to be missional. We aren't intentional about it. We don't invest in the whole discipleship journey. And in Cultivate, to help us do this, we've narrowed it down to a very simple process. It is not rocket science. But if you can make your plan around it, you will see fruit in those people you were called to. And this process has 3 stages. To help us remember them, they all start with E. We call them the 3 E's: engagement, encounter, early discipleship. And here's what they mean. Engagement. Engagement is about building relationships, making contact, meeting the needs of those people in your context, engaging those who are the focus of your missional vision. It is vital that we have a plan for this. What is your plan for how you are going to engage your target group in your context? Actually, churches for hundreds of years have been pretty good at engagement. They've been great at building relationships, caring for people, making contact. This often isn't a problem for us. Our problem is moving beyond this. You may know that the greatest provider for young families, for carers and young kids in this country is still churches. They still make more contact with mums and toddlers through church groups than any other organisation anywhere. But the truth is that these groups don't make and grow disciples largely. There will be some exceptions somewhere, I know, but it's not happening in general. And that is, I would suggest, because they don't plan for the whole discipleship journey. They have a brilliant plan for engagement, but no plan for moving people to our next stage, which is encounter. Very simply, this means planning for, praying for, working towards an encounter with Jesus. This will look different in every context, but it is about being intentional about it. What is your plan for how people you've engaged with are going to encounter Jesus? It must be contextual, it must be culturally relevant, it must be natural, it must make sense, but you must plan for it. Courses like Alpha, Christianity Explored, and the Start course are all great tools for this. That's why they've been so successful across the globe. They're classic encounter tools. Some people say, though, I've tried Alpha or Start, not doing it again, it didn't work. My answer always is this: these are great encounter tools, but they must come after your engagement phase. What was your plan for engagement beforehand? And what was your plan for early discipleship afterwards? So the third E, early discipleship. Once people have had an encounter with Jesus, how are you going to disciple them in the early days and months? What is that going to look like? How are they going to grow? And the vital thing about this stage, as it is with all the others, you know what I'm going to say, is it must be contextual. It must make sense for that group of people. It must be something that is culturally relevant. It must be natural, fits in with their way of life, their patterns, their culture. That's why it needs work. It needs attention. It needs your prayer and discernment. Be creative, be contextual, be intentional. Once you have encounter, how are you going to plan for early discipleship? The making and growing of disciples sits in box 2 of our insistent, important matrix. It is important, vitally important, but because it has no pressing deadline, it will not happen unless we plan for it, unless we prioritise it, unless we are intentional about it, unless we invest in the whole discipleship journey. Okay, let's discuss a couple of questions in our group. And if you have time, use the sheet on page 22 of the workbook, listing on the empty matrix the activities you do in church or ministry that fit into those different quadrants. Things like church rotas, family discipleship, telling people about Jesus, PCC meetings, etc. Fill it in and talk about it with your group. We'll see you back in 15 minutes.
If you didn't get around to the matrix on page 22, I will encourage you to prayerfully consider it and fill it in the coming weeks. A story for you. A young camel went up to his dad one day and said, "Dad, why have I got this big hump?" And his dad said, "Son, that's because when we're out in the desert, it's important to have a fat storage system. And basically that's what your hump is." "Oh, thanks, Dad," said his son. "You are wise." And he went away. Later, the young camel came back to his dad and said, "Dad, why have I got these long eyelashes?" And his dad said, "Son, that's because when we're out in the desert, it's important to have something to keep the sand out of our eyes." "Oh, thanks, Dad. You're so wise." And he went on his way again. But later, he came back and asked, "Dad, why have I got flat feet?" And his dad said, "Son, that's because when we're out in the desert, it's important to have flat feet because it helps us to walk across the sand rather than sink into it." And his son looked at his dad and said, "So why, Dad, are we living in Chester Zoo?" Camels in Chester Zoo and worship communities can sometimes have the same problem. They are not or are no longer well adapted to the context that they find themselves in. In fact, sometimes they've never been adapted to the context and the culture that they find themselves in. Context is so very, very important in starting new worship communities. Can I press our red button here? Our red light is flashing. The siren is going off. Here we go. Unless we pay attention to our context, the culture in which we find ourselves, then the starting of new worship communities, the refreshing of existing worship communities, will be severely hampered. I can't overstate this. Context is vitally important for many reasons, but here are just two of them. Firstly, context is important because context usually determines the calling. We spoke about calling in session 3, so we won't go over that again, but sometimes we make it into this mystical thing. What is God calling me to? Where are the visions? Where are the trumpets? The most natural place to plant is where you are naturally embedded, your neighborhood, your friendship group, your workplace, your community, your hobbies. Cross-cultural mission is a very difficult, timely, consuming task. Some people are called to it, but I honestly believe that they are the exception. Plant in your place. Start in your context. Begin where you are. Context is important because context nearly always determines calling. And secondly, context is important because context should determine the form of your community, the form, the shape of your plant. Let me tell you a story of two situations that I have had personal experience of. I'll avoid names, but I'll briefly outline them. My friend grew up in Nigeria, the son of missionaries. Now, Nigeria has a history of lots of missionaries. Many of them were American missionaries who lived in compounds which were set apart. They lived in Western homes. They drove Western cars, spoke English. So no surprise then that the Nigerians who became Christians through these ministries often went to Western-style churches. They often wore Western clothes, went to Western-style buildings called churches, read books by American and English writers, watched American and English video clips. The Nigerians often struggled to separate the gospel from Western affluence. It seemed obvious that when you become a Christian, you get stuff. The gospel clearly results in power, success, wealth, and health. That was Nigeria. That's the first situation. Second situation. There was a pioneer minister in the Church of England. His desire was to reach young people, and so he started hanging out in skate parks. He hung out with the young skaters. He learned how to skateboard, learnt the culture, the language, everything. But he was worried about freaking them out with the gospel. It felt like a step too far. When asked what his mission looked like, he said, well, we sit on the half pipe and we do yoga. That's what they understood. That's what they get. That's what it looks like. These two examples illustrate two dangers that can happen when gospel and culture collide. When you're trying to bring the gospel into whatever culture or subculture that you're called to, which is what we're doing when we start new worship communities. There are two dangers that planters, missionaries, all too often fall into. And one of them is a strong gospel, weak culture position that we call the gospel crush. This is what those Western missionaries in Nigeria often fell into. It's what the missionary movement of the 19th and 20th century fell into, even though they were remarkable and courageous people. It's what contemporary church planters fall into when they rock up at a high school and start by setting up a contemporary worship service rather than listening to the culture of where they are, or failing to incarnate the gospel in a way that people of that culture will hear and understand. The error and the big button is still going off at this point. The siren is still sounding. The error is deciding beforehand what the shape of your worship community will look like and not listening to the culture, not allowing it to shape what church, what mission, discipleship, worship, leadership will look like. In the gospel crush, gospel has crushed the culture. I've seen this happen many times. And if you fall into this strong gospel, weak culture trap, then people just won't listen. They'll be speaking a different language. This is, I dare to say, one of the big problems of contemporary church, of established church. We're often speaking a language that very few people recognize anymore. Very few people hear it and very few people respond to it. The second danger is a strong culture, weak gospel position that I call the culture crush. It's what my pioneer friend fell into, and if truth be told, what a lot of youth work falls into. And I know this because I spent many years as a youth worker and as a youth pastor myself. And this danger is elevating the importance of cultural integrity to such a degree that you allow the culture to dilute the essential message of the gospel. The gospel just won't translate, or you're afraid it won't. And so let's dilute and dilute and dilute until we have a message that we're happy to put across. And the problem with that is that the gospel, it just gets lost. Lives aren't really changed, disciples aren't really made, transformation doesn't really happen. In the culture crush, culture has crushed the gospel. Tim Keller wrote this in his book, Centre Church. If you forget the first truth, that there is no cultureless presentation of the gospel, you will think there is only one true way to communicate it. And you are on your way to a rigid, culturally bound conservatism. If you forget the second truth, that there is only one true gospel, you may fall into relativism, which will lead to a rudderless liberalism. Either way, you will be less faithful and less fruitful in ministry. This is a huge issue, not just in starting new worship communities, but in the church at large. Most of us have a bias one way or the other, either a strong gospel, weak culture position or a strong culture, weak gospel position. We either crush culture or we crush gospel. And as Tim Keller points out, either way, you'll be less faithful and less fruitful in ministry. And this is a massive issue for the church at large. As the president of a large Protestant denomination once said recently, I've come to realise that the cutting edge of missiology and our most urgent need in mission today is contextualisation. Unless we present the gospel locally in ways that connect to people's language, culture and worldview, we will fail in our efforts at world evangelization. So how do we avoid these two extremes, these two dangers? How do we avoid crushing culture or crushing the gospel? It starts by being aware of the problem, deeply aware, which is why we're talking about it, being attentive and alert to the issue. But then it requires a crucial skill called double listening. This is a process which involves listening to the world, paying attention to the culture in which you are called to bring your message, understanding your context, being a student of it, and then it involves listening to the gospel, paying attention to the call for discipleship, ensuring that it's not lost or diluted in its delivery. What your worship community looks like and feels like should reflect your context. And context is about asking many obvious questions. For example, where is the place that I am now? Who are those people I'm surrounded by? What are they like? What do they do? What do they think about? What do they value? What is their culture? Sometimes those who start new worship communities take no notice of context. They plant a church or worship community based on what they think church should be like. And when I say that, I actually mean me. I once planted a church and made this very mistake. And I see it over and over again. What our new worship communities look like should be influenced and affected by our context, by those people we're trying to reach. Paying attention to context is absolutely vital. Context is important because it usually determines calling, and context is important because it should determine the form and nature of your worship community. I really do hope that you've enjoyed this session today. as we have explored the question of what do we plant, starting to look at the top 5 characteristics of new worship communities. And we've looked at the top 4 so far. Next time we'll be looking at the 5th of our top 5 characteristics of new worship communities, looking at the key priorities of a worship community, which are mission, discipleship, community, worship and leadership. But for now, let's just end with a couple of questions in our groups.